Nice turnout. I see David Cressy? Did anybody get him out to the library to see it? Did you get to see the library? Okay, I was gonna say.
That's okay. I got here.
Excellent. Well, yeah, and I was in a business meeting. Yeah, can you take him out real quick, Mark? It's probably unlocked anyway. Okay, Janice, I'm going to turn this over to you. The Zoom session is actually already started, so you just have to, when people pop up, admit them in.
One at a time? Or?
Yeah, it'll come up like individual things. Like you'll see XXX has joined this thing. I am going to smoke really quick, and by the time I'm done with that, we should be ready because it should be about 7 minutes still. Correct? Okay. Oh, yeah. And John is one.
Can I sneak back here? Excuse me, Mr. Wilson.
Nick is here.
Perhaps.
How you doing, buddy?
Okay.
See you.
All right.
How's life? I know. It's nice to be rested out. How's things going? Good. We haven't been out on the golf course yet. I haven't even played at all yet. I'm not playing. Yeah, right. Exactly.
Hi, Liz. How are you? Good. How are you? May 15th. Almost a year.
This is
Oh, are they having a good time? All that fun stuff.
But
Absolutely.
they have good weather so far.
You have a couple more days to enjoy the peace, right?
Yeah.
There you go.
I'm sorry we missed trivia. I heard some of the questions. They were pretty good. I know you were a quizmaster. Yeah, he brought some questions.
I don't think we knew them, no. Yeah. They were good. It's still a lot.
Yeah.
He was just happy they weren't lost.
Yeah. Yeah, I haven't been out. Timmy, my neighbor up there, wants to go every Wednesday. Right. He's going to text me. He's walking. Now he's sick on the couch. You met him yet? Yeah.
Just when you find your well, we're gonna go there. You can get your money back. You can find
Okay, yeah, this is well, and apparently you're like you, so no, very good. Very good. I think we'll
Yeah, I'm running a little after. Just again, I know there's still people studying, so I want to make sure everybody gets
Oh, really? Exactly what you paid.
So I hope it's okay. I parked in the lawn across the street.
I hope you do a burnout on your way out. Please, please, we're up so you can plant potatoes in.
I saw you come around the hat. I thought it was going to be quick.
Are you Yough?
I don't know if you saw me there. How are you doing this for the museum?
Yes,
What's that guy behind you?
I know, he's a little shaky.
Yeah,
Hi, Doug. How are you?
I'm well. How are you?
You're looking well.
Thank you.
And I can't remember if someone
What about you? You been getting some? Appreciate that. I understand.
Indeed, yes.
You in the middle.
Yes.
That man don't follow me. You say the word.
That's him. I was just making it for his swiftness.
Just gonna say, oh,
Instead of holding his tire, let's not show up on it. Just maybe. Oh, dear. How can you be a Douglas? Yes. Yep. He's also
yes, that I did.
So is this where we get started? That's good.
No, I think they started with the 7.
Has anybody joined in yet?
I'm here.
Let's see it. Try it now. Okay, I was gonna say, yeah, it hadn't showed you as admitted yet, so. All right, there you go.
Excuse me.
I'll tell you what, Dave, can you help him with this? Okay, I can't. I will be busy for the next week.
Can I have your attention? Whoever owns the blue F-150 needs to see Dave, please.
Here I am.
Wasn't me. Well, no, let's see. Take a look at that.
Beverly, could you come here a minute, please?
Yeah, exactly.
What? Because I think I'm recording this and I don't want to. So I can't stop it.
How did you do that?
I tried all that.
Just keep it like that. I don't understand.
That's right.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't know what you're doing. There we go. Start video, leave.
Wait.
I have no idea. I'm gonna use up all my space though. I have no idea what you're doing.
I don't
Leave.
Yeah.
Yeah, now see it's recording.
We saw it up in Pittsburgh, and we saw it. The boat didn't sink. Fire and mechanism, and they used that in the one.
Anytime I have one, like that. You keep it out. That way.
Well, it's kind of hard. They just keep coming in. Yeah, before the lines go yeah, we'll wait till everybody settles into their spot when he's talking, and I'll get a better count. But yeah, this is yeah. Oh, absolutely. I like to think that they all bring up in the spring. Well, you know, maybe.
Silver Sable park next to the railroad tracks. Need unit for that one too.
What is it?
Silver Sable. That's you? Come with me.
You're the lucky winner. Actually, I think if you go around behind, there's a little opening there. You can get through there. If they have set up fire.
First day,
it is nice. Yeah. Now, you know, like just the way, you know. Interesting.
Information that we can learn today. I think there'll be a lot of information.
I forget what the first year party and it didn't get on the show because something. And they were like,
ready? This. Is there any I'm brief.
Something better.
Excellent. You mean for membership? I was actually going to do that. Yep. Unless you want to. I'll take care of it. Because I'm going to do the joint thing we talked about a while ago. All right. Good afternoon, evening, whatever time of day it is, everyone. I don't know. I've been here all day, so you'll have to bear with me. My staff and I are all pretty tired, but we like to work, so it's a good thing. I see a lot of familiar faces here, which is a wonderful thing. And as you know, our lecture series, we have been co-hosting the last several months in coordination with the Yough Chapter 3 of the Society for American Archaeology. They are housed actually here. They're out in one of our other buildings. And we've been working together on several projects for quite some time. And I wanted to let everybody know that if you are interested in joining with a membership to the Greene County Historical Society or the Yough Chapter 3, we actually offer a reduced rate if you join both organizations at one time. So if anybody is interested in that, a family membership is $40, which you're saving a fair amount of money if you join both. So I will have these forms here. If anybody is interested, they'll be on the table over here. So feel free to take these and fill them out, and the address is on there. You can send it back to us, and you'll be supporting not one, but two nonprofit organizations in Greene County. And we're both the groups that put these together for all of you guys to enjoy. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce my good friend, Pat Fitch, who, much to my surprise, actually is quite the expert on the RMS Titanic. And as many of you know, we just had the anniversary of the sinking a few days ago. So I'm going to turn over to Pat and let him talk so I don't bore you guys. Oh, and one last announcement. If you are joining us on Zoom, if you could please mute your mic so we don't get feedback on the session. We greatly appreciate that. So here's Pat.
All right, thank you. All right, I'll speak loudly because I know some have hearing impediments, but I'm glad there's more than one person that showed up for this tonight. And I hope you will enjoy the presentation. This is an actual official hat that the White Star Line officers of the Titanic would have worn. I did not get the scrambled eggs on the bill because I'm not the Commodore and I'm not the captain. And Captain Smith will get a little bit of criticism tonight, and I don't want to be associated with him. I'd rather be with the first officer, second officer, and down the line. But if I may wear the hat to give it some air of authenticity, I'll do that now. The first official function with my hat from England and the Titanic, okay? Also, you see these buttons I have on my sport coat. Waterbury is the company that made these buttons. Waterbury is the company that made the buttons for White Star Line officers to include the Titanic. They are actually based in New York, but J. Pierpont Morgan invested so much money in the Titanic, the mother company is in England. But because of J.P. Morgan, they opened up an office in New York, hence they still have an office in New York today. So the wonderful ladies at the Waynesburg Sewing Center, Betty and Linda, unfortunately, the Sewing Center has recently closed, changed the buttons out on my sport coat so I could look very official for you tonight. So thank you for your indulgence. We'll talk about the Titanic tonight. The Titanic has quite a grip, even after 110 years on everyone. What is it about the Titanic that draws the interest of so many? And not just the United States, not just in England, but all over the world. There seems to be a captivation with the ship, its history, its legacy, and its ultimate fate. And before I go on, I do have to point out a couple of people who are in the crowd tonight that have been very dear to me in history. The first one being Mr. Gary Gernert, who's sitting over here, was my 8th grade history teacher and told me on a fall day in 1982, I was sitting in his class, I remember everything. And he said he got up there and I actually yawned. And I wasn't tired of, he wasn't boring me. And he said, well, Mr. Fitch, you know, yawning is contagious. And there was a comedian who went up on stage and started yawning all the time. And before the show was over, everybody was yawning. And then he said, he talked about history. History starts when someone started writing things down. So I'm glad there's a lot written about the Titanic. So we'll get some interesting facts for you tonight. Hopefully some things you've never heard before. Yes, good. Okay. And the other gentleman I'd like to recognize is Mr. Joseph Arisman, who was my high school history teacher. And he and I started a tradition of talking about Titanic every April 14th. So for 4 years at Waynesburg High School, Mr. Arisman let me come into his history class and give presentations on the Titanic on the anniversary date. And then for 4 years while I was at Waynesburg College, he had me come back. I actually came back from law school on an April day and talked about the Titanic. So Mr. Arisman, I'm glad to see you're here. And all of you who came tonight out of your day, took time out of your day to come listen to me talk about the Titanic. So thank you very much, Mr. and Mrs. Tiger, the Boyds. Thank you so much, everybody. Mr. McCracken. I feel like romper room. I see Billy. The Titanic, the keel was laid in 1909 in Belfast, Ireland. Now, Cunard was the competing company with White Star Line. Cunard ships were known for their speed. Getting to and from England to the United States, it would take a week, 1 week travel time. White Star Line, competing with Cunard, wanted to make ships that were known for luxury, not necessarily speed, but for the luxury of the ship. So the Titanic was absolutely opulent, grandeur, and had everything that was built into it. Very time consuming, 2 years to construct this beautiful ship. Every detail was attended to. Everything about the ship, first class. I had the opportunity to go to Belfast with President Bush. I'm a former special agent in the Secret Service, and I remember being new to President Bush's detail on the counter surveillance squad. I was sitting in our squad bay, and I knew there was a trip coming up going overseas, but I was the new guy, and I'm not gonna, I would have gone, but anyway, my group leader came up to me and said, "You want to go on this trip?" I said, "Of course I do. Where are we going?" He said, "Belfast, Ireland." I went, "I definitely want to go to Belfast, Ireland." So we stayed in a hotel. We flew over on a C5 over to Shannon, or I'm sorry, more further north in Belfast. The Titanic Historical Society from Belfast was staying in the same hotel we were staying in. I couldn't believe it. What are the chances? But I said to the other 50 agents, we flew over on this C5, the Titanic was built here in Belfast. Let's go see it. Well, we don't want to go see that. I said, it's an hour out of your day to go see where the Titanic was built. When are you going to be in Belfast again, right? We're going to the pubs. I said, "You heathens, you go ahead." So I got a taxi, and I'm by myself, and I'm riding to the Harland and Wolff shipyards. You know, I grew up a fan of the Titanic. Here I am, the motherland of the Titanic. And I'm looking at the huge cranes they call Samson and Goliath, big H and W on the cross beams. And I said to the taxi cab driver, "Holy cow, the Titanic was built here." And he stopped the car and he looked back at me and he goes, "Yeah, we built her and the English sank her." Half of me is English, half of me is Irish, so I'm a walking contradiction. I didn't say anything. And then he said, "Yeah, I tell you what, if we'd had an Irishman at the helm, we never would hit that iceberg either." Okay, so I got to see where the Titanic was built. So the Titanic is launched in April of 1912. April of 1912. Sea trials for a ship the size of the Titanic, actually for any ship, should be at least 2 weeks. Why do you have sea trials? Sea trials give the officers and the captain familiarity with the ship. How long would it take to stop the ship if there was something sighted in front of the ship, like an iceberg? How long would it take to turn to avoid hitting the object? How long would it take to properly dock the ship? Of course, you have a pilot who's from the local area that gets on board the big ship to help dock the ship. But anyway, these trials should last 2 weeks. Titanic's trials lasted half a day. Half a day. So, and basically the fifth officer who survived Said all they did was take her out and do big S turns and brought her back. That was it. He said when we left Belfast to go to Southampton, they were still doing S turns. There was still some unfamiliarity with the size of this ship. Now I have a PowerPoint I'll be showing the size of the Titanic compared to other ships of the day. And you'll see just how gigantic the Titanic is compared to those ships in 1912. You'll also see a picture of the Titanic. It's been framed, obviously, but the Titanic in front of a modern day ocean liner. So you can see the difference between today's ocean liners to the Titanic. So when the Titanic got to Southampton, they had the officer lineup. You had the chief officer, H.T. Wild, who was also on the Olympic, the sister ship of the Titanic. Captain Smith took the Olympic over to New York on its maiden voyage the year before. And when he took the Olympic over to New York, he wrecked it. Now he's in charge of the ship. He's the captain. When they were coming into dock, the hydrodynamic forces from the three big propellers beneath the Titanic sucked in a tugboat right under the stern. And it got caught under there. So other tugboats had to get over there to pull it out of there. And Captain Smith was not reprimanded for that. Now, he's the master and commander of that ship. Nothing was done. He was the senior most officer of the White Star Line, the Commodore. He was basically untouchable. They called him the millionaire's captain because in those days, the millionaires would travel on these ocean liners and they wanted their pick of who's the captain of the ship. Smith was very popular with all the millionaires. But another incident that happened with the Olympic, Captain Smith was in charge of the ship. They collided with the British cruiser Hawk. The hydrodynamic forces sucked that British cruiser right into the Olympic, and another collision happened. So that's two wrecks before the Titanic with the Olympic. So Captain Smith gets to Southampton. He sees the officer lineup. The second officer initially was David Blair. Smith looked at the lineup and said, I don't want Blair on this trip. I want Wild as my chief officer. So what had happened, the original chief officer was Bill Murdock. Bill Murdock was bumped from chief to first. First officer was Herbert Lightoller. He was bumped from first to second. David Blair was second. He got booted off the ship. He was actually on the ship getting ready to go. And he had his berth and everything. So he had to go to the cabin and get his clothing and leave the ship. Then the remaining officers stayed the same. The third officer, Herbert Pittman, the fourth officer, Joseph Boxhall, the fifth officer, Lowe, and the sixth officer, James Moody. So that was the lineup. And I'll show you pictures once we get the PowerPoint started. But a question had always been asked about binoculars. Why didn't the lookout have binoculars in the crow's nest? The second officer was in charge of the lookout or the binoculars. They called them glasses. He had the key. The glasses were locked in the second officer's room. He took the key with him. I don't know if it was by mistake or he just didn't. He took the key with him and left the ship. So the binoculars are locked and now second officer Herbert Lightoller's room. So the lookouts had said to Captain Smith, we need, before they even left Southampton, we need the glasses. Lightoller said, I'll get those to you. I'll get them to you. He never did. It never happened. You know, for a ship the size of the Titanic, what would it have taken just to break open that lockbox and give those guys the binoculars so they'd have had that much more advance notice or something ahead of the ship. But anyway, so the Titanic leaves Southampton, England, and as it's leaving, again, those hydrodynamic forces I told you the Olympic had trouble with the Hawk and also the tugboat in New York. As it's leaving Southampton, there were two ships stacked almost like double parked, and the outer ship was the New York. And those same hydrodynamic forces sucked the New York and snapped the mooring lines on that ship. And it literally came within a foot of hitting the Titanic. But the Vulcan tugboat rushed out there and averted disaster and pushed the New York off. And the Titanic was able to make its way out of the dock and out into the transatlantic run. But there was a crew member on the Titanic that saw that happen. His name was John Coffey. And he said to Mrs. Albert Caldwell, the second class passenger, if you value your life, I would not stay on this ship to go to New York. That's a bad omen. That just happened. I don't think that's a good sign. So when they got to Cherbourg, France, there were some people that disembarked. That was the end of their voyage. Getting on the ship in Cherbourg was Molly Brown, who we all know is the unsinkable Molly Brown, right? Well, she's boarding the ship with Emma Bucknell. Now, I know there's some friends in here who are associated with Bucknell University. Mr. and Mrs. Boyd. I'm looking if I just saw you. Where's Mr. Boyd? Oh, right here. Okay, Mr. and Mrs. Boyd. Their son graduated from Bucknell University. My daughter, Erin, is just finishing up her freshman year at Bucknell University. So I'm reading those 3 books on the table way over to the left. One of them talked about this Emma Bucknell from Philadelphia, who's getting on board the Titanic. She's with Molly Brown, and she gets this incredibly bad omen that she shouldn't go on the ship. And she says to Molly Brown, I have a bad feeling, this premonition, we shouldn't sail on the Titanic. Molly Brown starts laughing at her and says, what are you talking about? It's safer than a motor car. It's unsinkable. Well, the Shipbuilder magazine, when it reviewed the intricate deck work of the Titanic and the bulkheads, the transverse bulkheads, the watertight compartments, said that the Titanic was practically unsinkable. Not that it was unsinkable. There was a qualifier, practically unsinkable. Everybody forgets the practically part, but it's unsinkable. The ship's unsinkable. So anyway, a few days later, when Emma Bucknell was getting into a lifeboat with Molly Brown, she said, what did I tell you in Cherbourg? I told you something. So that was another, as the Titanic was leaving Cherbourg, there were no seagulls around the ship at all, which is highly unusual. So another crew member said, that's a bad omen. They're getting picking up all these bad omens. John Coffey was still on the ship. When they got to Queenstown, Ireland, which is now Cove today, he went AWOL. He said, I'm not going to New York on the ship. He left the Titanic and actually joined the Mauritania a couple days later. He was a fireman, which had a high suicide rate. They were the guys that shoveled coal into those boilers. The Titanic had 29 huge boilers. But so he leaves the ship and says, I'm not going to New York. And fortunately for him, he made the right choice. So the Titanic starts its transatlantic run. The weather is very cool, but the first couple days, what I'll do is pass around some postcards. And when Matt is still around,
Yes.
Okay. Whenever we can start the PowerPoint, I'll put in that if that's okay.
Yeah, whenever you're ready, Pat.
Okay. Well, that'll come up on here,
Yes.
and I'll be able to advance the slide from there.
Yes, you have to do it from the laptop, but yes.
Okay. All right. Let's see. We'll start with first. You'll see this is just a little postcard of the Titanic. We'll start it around. Okay. Now, another interesting thing about the Titanic, the chief officer, Yough, as they were leaving Southampton to go to France, he wrote a letter to his sister. And he said in the letter, I have a queer feeling about this ship. And that's the chief officer saying. And he posted the letter to his sister in France. Now, I want to go back and read something to you. Now, this is a paper I did when I was in college. The Sinking of the Titanic, a Case of Negligence. I entered it into a national competition with the Criminal Justice Honor Society, and it took first place. You know, there may have been only 2 people that entered the paper. I'll just put that up there. So, but I was one of the ones that entered the paper. So there's a quote here from someone who was watching the Titanic be built. Now, I'm sorry if I'm jumping around a little bit, but this gives you an idea of the size of the Titanic. Okay, the Titanic, the Belfast shipyards of Harland and Wolff in Ireland, an observer noted, for months and months in that monstrous iron enclosure, there was nothing that had the faintest likeness to a ship. Only something that might have been the iron scaffolding for the naves of half a dozen cathedrals laid end to end. At last, the skeleton within the scaffolding began to take shape, at the sight of which men held their breaths, It was the shape of a ship so monstrous and unthinkable that it towered there over the buildings and dwarfed the very mountains by the water. A rudder as big as a giant elm tree. Bosses and bearings of propellers the size of windmills. Everything was on a nightmarish scale, and underneath the iron foundations of the cathedral floor, men were lying on concrete beds, pavements of oak and great cradles of timber and iron, and sliding ways of pitch and pine to support the bulk of the monster when she was moved. Every square inch of the pavement surface bearing a weight of more than 2 tons. 20 tons of tallow were spread upon the ways, and hydraulic rams and triggers built and fixed against the bulk of the ship so that when the moment came, the water she was to conquer could thrust her finally from Earth. So it was this giant monster ship that the locals were watching being constructed. So now it's on its transatlantic run. And on April 11th, they get a message from the Empress of Britain. And I'm going to pass this postcard around from the Empress of Britain, which was based, I'll just pass all these around and look those through. So, and I can start this up now.
Yep. We keep moving.
I want to get close.
All right, thank you. Okay, so for the next 4 hours, just try to relax. All right.
I don't think we're going to see the PowerPoint presentation.
Okay. Titanic, you all can see that? Okay, very good.
They can't see.
I'll kind of go through these and then get right back to the story. I think you
Who's
want
going to see us?
That's the Titanic in front of a modern day ocean
I
liner.
don't even know what you did here. Oh, we'll watch it.
Isn't it?
Huh?
The Titanic is that little ship right in the front. Here, I bought this at the dollar store for $1, so now I can use it. Or not. There it is. There it is, okay. Looks like that big ship's gonna eat the Titanic, doesn't it? Okay, so you have that, and then construction phase. Like I told you, you can see the gallows, see all the Irishmen. There were 15,000
How do I shut
Irishmen
this off? I can't
working
see
on
this.
the Titanic 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, for 2 years to get this ship done.
I'm sorry, what?
Shut it
Of
off.
course, they brought the anchors to the train station to get it to.
I can't see.
You want to exit?
Yeah.
So I built a model, ladies and gentlemen. It's over on that table. 150 scale Titanic. I think you'll enjoy it after the presentation. If you want to take a look at it, you'll see the propellers and everything like that.
How many hours, Pat?
That's right, the Irish. There was only one Irishman working on that one. It took me 5 months. The last one I built, it took me 4 years to build. Again, it was only one Irishman working on it, not 24 hours a day. So, and it has 2 wing propellers that weigh 38 tons. Center propeller weighed 22 tons. Port and starboard anchors each weigh 30,000 pounds each, and you'll see those on the model too. 15,000 Irishmen worked on her 24 hours a day, 7 days a week for 2 hours. Now, there were a lot of injuries and deaths during the construction of the Titanic. 246 injuries were recorded. Back then, there was really no attention paid to safety. No hard helmets, no lines, no guardrails. 28 severe injuries were arms and severed legs were done by machines, falling off of pieces of steel. 6 people died on the ship as she was being constructed and fitted out. 1 died just before the launch. In fact, 1 gentleman had a heart attack when the ship was launched into the river there. So 882.5 feet long. That comes to 296 yards, 4 yards shy of 3 football fields. 92 feet in beam, that's her width. Her height, 175 feet. She weighed 46,328 tons, 9 decks, and I'll talk about the decks in a moment. Here are the officers, ladies and gentlemen. The 6th officer on the far left, James Moody, he would die and go down with the ship. The 5th officer, Harold Godfrey Lowe, he would survive. The fourth officer on the far right, Joseph Boxhall, he too would survive. He would actually help with the making of the movie A Night to Remember. The far left, you see Pittman, third officer Herbert Pittman, he would survive. The second officer in the middle, Herbert Lightoller, he survives. The first officer on the far right is Bill Murdock. He was in charge of the bridge when the Titanic hit the iceberg. He actually took his own life. That's the chief officer, Henry Wilde, who wrote to his sister and said, I have a queer feeling about this ship, as they were headed to France. He would go down with the ship. He was last seen standing near the bridge smoking a cigarette, and he waved goodbye to the second officer. Captain Edward John Smith, decorated officer in the Royal Naval Reserve. Now, I'll tell you something about Smith. Senior most officer, when you look at the model, on the very aft end of the ship, you'll see the blue ensign. Instead of the Union Jack, which most ships would fly on the tail of the ship on the stern, he was allowed and permitted to fly the blue ensign because he was also an officer in the Naval Reserve. He had two medals you can actually see right there. Let's see if this works again. That's $1, you know?
I think you need to turn it around the other way.
Yes. Anyway, you see the two medals. We'll go the old way. Right there. One was for safely transporting British troops during the Boer War in 1898. So he was decorated for that. The other one was for the Royal Naval Reserve. So those are the medals he had. Because he was a naval officer in the reserve, he was permitted to fly the blue ensign off the tail of the ship, off the stern. So you can see that on the model. It's blue with the British insignia. Like I said, the senior most officer in the White Star Line, 40 years at sea, 27 years at command. The millionaires captain, very popular with millionaires and passengers. Although Major Puchin, who I'll talk about later, didn't care much for Smith at all. And when he found out he was booked on the Titanic and Smith was the captain, he went, oh, not that guy, you know, because he knew about the wrecks with the Olympic. There's Captain Smith on the left with Chief Purser Herbert McElroy, and there's Lord William Peary, chairman of Harland and Wolff. He was in charge of Harland and Wolff shipyards with Captain Smith there. The wireless operators, John Phillips on the left, he actually turned 25 years old on the second day of the Titanic's voyage. 22-year-old Harold Bride is to your right. Bride would survive, Phillips would not. Phillips was the one sending out the distress signals. We'll talk about that in just a little bit. And that's the wireless room you see for the Titanic. That's probably taken on the Olympic, which was the sister ship, like I said, of the Titanic, but that's exactly what it looked like. Lookouts Fred Fleet and Reginald Lee, we'll talk about them. The band, Wallace Hartley and his band members, we'll talk about them too. You had on the cello, John Woodward, bass violin, John Frederick Preston Clark, violin, Jacques Hume, the cello, Percy Taylor, the violin, George Crins, and William Theodore Ronald Bailey. He also played violin, or piano rather, but he played violin as well. These musicians were excellent. They were contracted by the White Star Line to play on the ships. Some of them were on the Mauritania with Cunard, but they were contracted out. So White Star Line, they say, well, we want 3 violin players, 1 a piano player. They would go to the company that employed the musicians, and they picked the best musicians on the transatlantic to serve on the Titanic. A few of them, including Wallace Hartley, the band leader, had just become engaged, and his wife really didn't want him to go to sea anymore. They wanted to start a family. He was going to start working landslide, or in the pubs, not necessarily the pubs, but the orchestra halls and everything like that back in England, and stop traveling with the ships so he could raise a family. But his wife, or his fiance, gave him a violin with an inscription on it that he played on the night the Titanic was sinking. That violin is in Pigeon Forge, Tennessee, at the Titanic Museum down there. It's on display. They paid $1.6 million for that violin. That's on display. But anyway, that's the ship's band. We'll talk about them momentarily. Okay. Charles Baker, we'll talk about him. I want to get some faces to the names, so when I tell you the story, you'll have an idea of who's who. This fellow on the right was at the ship's wheel when they hit the iceberg. Robert Hitchens, quartermaster Robert Hitchens. They called him the man that sank the Titanic. So he did survive. Yes, he did. Yep. Then famous passengers, millionaire Benjamin Guggenheim on the upper left. You see Major Puchin next from Canada. He was the one very critical of Captain Smith. Elsie Bowman, who was a socialite. Emma Bucknell on the lower right. Edith Rosenbaum, who was a silent screen actress. Charlie Hayes. The Goodman family, they were in third class. They all died. Oh, thank you very much. Archibald Gracie, Mr. and Mrs. Isidore Strauss. He was the founder of Macy's department store. So, look through here. He did not survive. Okay. Some more of the famous passengers. I don't want to, be a slave to the PowerPoint. I'd rather talk to you. So, okay. So, the Titanic, I have a nice display of what's going on when they start getting the Empress of Britain. That's the ship that sent the congratulatory message to Captain Smith. Officers themselves send greetings and best of luck to the Titanic, our officers and commander. Signed, Murray, commander of the Empress of Britain. Titanic responded, many thanks for your kind message from all here, Smith. La Terrain on the evening of April 12th. My position 7 p.m. GMT, latitude 49 degrees, 28 minutes, longitude 26 degrees, 28 minutes. Dense fog since this night. Crossed, thick ice field, gave the latitude position. Saw another ice field. I won't bore you with all the details, but the La Terrain, that's another ice warning that the Titanic received on April 12th, 2 days before the collision. The Rappahannock, this one's very interesting. They didn't communicate with each other via wireless, but instead they used the Morse lamp. The Rappahannock had just emerged from a dangerous ice field and says, have just passed through heavy ice and several icebergs. Titanic, the great White Star liner, decks blazing with lights. Flashback, a brief acknowledgement. Message received, thanks, good night. And the Titanic hurried on into the night. The Rappahannock had actually twisted her rudder and dented her bow in that ice field. So that's another ice warning that the Titanic received, April 13th. The Caronia and Nordam also sent ice warnings to the Titanic. So you can see they're getting several of these ice warnings. This is on April 14th. The Baltic, yet another ice warning to the Titanic. And they're giving the position of the ice field. The America, same thing, sending ice warnings to the Titanic. The Californian and Mesaba. The Californian we'll talk about momentarily. The Mesaba, this was right near the time the Titanic is approaching that very dangerous thick patch of ice. There was an ice field in front of the Titanic that was 75 miles wide. And instead of slowing down, the Titanic is speeding up after receiving all of these ice warnings. The Californian, the last ice warning at 11 p.m. They're stopped for the night. Cyril Evans was the wireless operator, and he tries to signal the Titanic, and he says, I say, old man, we're stopped and surrounded by ice. The Titanic rattles back, John Phillips, shut up, I'm busy, I'm working Cape Race. He signaled to Cape Race, and sorry, please repeat, I was jammed. That's what he said to Cape Race. So with that, Cyril Evans turned off his transmission set, the wireless. He just tried to warn the Titanic, we're stopped for the night. It's 11 o'clock. Phillips, their wireless apparatus had shut down the day before. There was a short circuit. So when they fixed it, he had a backlog of messages to send to Cape Race. The passengers had paid for to send messages to Cape Race, which was a relay station to send to New York. So Phillips was busy doing that. He didn't want to hear anything about this ice warning that the Californian was sending. The Mesaba had sent an ice warning. Phillips wrote it down, but put it on his desk. They didn't take it to the bridge. So there was no warning about that either. So and that's the iceberg. Now we'll get back to the story. 11 o'clock p.m. the Titanic is going 22.5 knots in waters they know are filled with ice. Icebergs, field ice, pack ice, but they're going full speed ahead. 22.5 knots equals 25 miles an hour. So when you're driving in the borough of Waynesburg on Green Street or even High Street, you're approaching Fox Ford, speed limit there is 25 miles an hour. So imagine you're going 25 miles an hour, or you are. That's how fast the Titanic was going. You know, a 46,000 ton ship, 25 miles an hour, going right into the danger zone. It might be a bad analogy, but imagine driving on a highway and all of a sudden it comes down to one lane and there's traffic comes up and it's a construction area and you speed up. Why would you do that? There's too much danger. There's too many unknowns, people coming out, whatever. Well, the Titanic is speeding up 25 miles an hour, 22.5 knots. So at 11:40 p.m., the lookouts, Fred Fleet and Regional Lee, see something in front of the ship that's darker than the night itself. There was no moon. It was a flat calm. Later on, survivors said it was like a mill pond. It was like a dead stillness. There was no waves. There was nothing slapping up against the base of an iceberg, creating that white foam to give any indication. It was just complete blackness. So Fleet sees up ahead something looming. As he said, it was the size of a table at first, but then as the ship got closer and closer, it got bigger and bigger. So he hit the bell 3 times, which is a warning to the bridge, something's dead ahead. The 6th officer, James Moody, on the bridge, picked up the phone and calmly asked, "What did you see?" Fleet yells, "Iceberg right ahead." And he says, "Thank you." And he hangs the phone up. So Fleet and Lee are bracing now for impact. They did trials after the Titanic sank with the Olympic, and they came up with 37 seconds is how long it took before the ship's bow started to go to the left. So they're standing there. Are we going to hit it? It looks like we're going to hit it. There's drawing right toward the iceberg. On the bridge, First Officer William Murdock runs over to the starboard side of the ship, looks out, and he screams, "Hard to starboard, full speed astern," which is basically he's trying to make a left to try to get out of the way. Now remember, the sea trials for the Titanic only lasted half a day. The reason Captain Smith wanted Wild as his chief officer is because Wild had experience on the Olympic. He'd been on the Olympic for a year. He wanted some more experience on the bridge. Well, Wild wasn't on the bridge at that time. So they don't know how long it's going to take to stop this ship. You know, if they'd hit the iceberg head on, the ship would not have sunk. The damage would have been localized to the bow. There may have been some people killed, but the pumps would have been able to keep the water out and they would have been okay. But he's trying to make a left turn and get away and try to avoid disaster altogether. Had they seen the iceberg 30 seconds sooner, that could have made a difference. It could have cleared it, but it is what it is. And they felt that grinding noise along the starboard side of the ship. Once they hit the iceberg, you know, ice is falling onto the forecastle of the ship. There were men in the first class smoking room playing cards, having drinks. One fella spilled his drink. One passenger said it felt like rolling over 1,000 marbles. One lady said she could picture a dog with a kitten in its mouth, shaking it wildly. One steward who survived said it felt like they bumped up against the dock when they were coming in to berth the ship. One other steward said it felt like they dropped a propeller blade. He was certain that's what happened. We just lost the propeller blade. We're heading back to Belfast. But the ship is still moving. So Captain Smith comes out of his quarters and says to Murdock, "What happened?" Murdock says, "We struck an iceberg." He says, "Close the watertight doors." He goes, "I did." He goes, "Sound the ship, send the carpenter up here. I want to see what the damage is." So immediately he sends the 4th officer, Joseph Boxhall, to inspect the ship. Boxhall only went down so far. He didn't go all the way down to the mail room where the water was flooding already. So Boxhall comes back and says to Captain Smith, "There doesn't appear to be any damage." That was the last good news that Captain Smith would hear, because on the tail of that 4th officer, is a carpenter who came up and said the mailroom is filling up with water right now. So the Titanic had really 10 decks. You had the boat deck, the uppermost part of the ship. You had the A deck, which was the promenade deck, B deck, which had a lot of the first class cabins, then C deck to G deck, you know, passenger accommodations. Then below G deck, you had what's called the orlop deck. That had the mail room and the cargo holds. Below the orlop deck was what they called the tank top deck. That was the very bottom deck of the ship. That's where the engine room was and the boiler rooms. So when they came up, the carpenter came up and told the captain it's taking water on. They asked Thomas Andrews to come to the bridge, who was the architect of the ship from Harland and Wolff. Andrews was very popular at Harland and Wolff. He was a good leader in that he didn't work solely from his office at Harland and Wolff. He went down to the shipyards and talked with the Irishmen who were building it. Is there anything I can get you? Is there anything that would make your job easier? Are you running into any problems? He was a hands-on guy, not micromanaging, but macro-managing and being with the guys. So he was very popular with the Irishman that built her. Andrews comes up and he says, why have we stopped? And Captain Smith said, we struck an iceberg. What alarmed most of the passengers was not the hitting the iceberg, it was the ship coming to a stop. Something's wrong with her. So he says, I'd like to see how badly she's damaged. So Andrews goes down below with Captain Smith, the first officer. They see how much water has already entered the Titanic, how many holes. The first 5 compartments have now been ripped open. It used to be, and when I talked with Mr. Airsman, you know, it used to be believed it was a 300-foot continuous gash in the starboard side of the ship. You know, with all the dives to the wreck site and everything now, they've determined that it was 4 slits, separate slits that had damaged the Titanic. There was also a high sulfur content in the steel, which made it very brittle. And then in that cold North Atlantic water, it was 28 degrees, coming into contact with that, like shattered. The rivets were also called into question. There was maybe a cheaper composition. They weren't as hard or sturdy as the rivets should have been. So Andrews comes up, they meet on the bridge, and Andrews says the ship is going to, as they say, founder. John Bruce Ismay, the managing director of White Star Line, comes up. You may have seen the movie with Leonardo DiCaprio. That movie's okay. I would highly recommend A Night to Remember. It's an English-made movie. It's made in 1958. Extremely accurate. And Ismay is asking what's going on. Is the ship badly damaged? And Captain Smith said, yes, I believe it is. And Andrew says it's going to sink. And they come to realization there's only enough lifeboats on board for maybe a third of the passengers. What are we going to do? So, and Andrews, or Captain Smith says something to that effect about there's not enough lifeboats on the ship. Why did the Titanic have so few lifeboats? Well, shipping had advanced. You know, the ship's the size. I'll try to find that picture. The British Board of Trade Regulations said a ship that weighed 15,000 tons had to have 16 lifeboats. That was the rule. Well, the Titanic was 46,000 tons, yet it only had 20 lifeboats. They said, well, we've met the Board of Trade Regulations. We do have 16. In fact, we've gone above and beyond that. We've got 20 lifeboats. Nowhere near enough to save everybody, right? So there's the Titanic, and there's the side. You can see, can you see that okay? On the bow of the ship, you can see what the size of the other ships would have been on at that time. So what happens then? Captain Smith says, well, we're gonna have to start loading the lifeboats. Women and children first. So on the starboard side of the ship, the second officer, Lightoller, was in charge of loading lifeboats. On the port side of the ship, First Officer William Murdock was in charge of loading the lifeboats. So when they get out there, I've read about Captain Smith and the effect this may have had on him. He was going to retire after this voyage, senior most officer, celebrated by the White Star Line, very popular. The grandest, most opulent ship in the world, the biggest man-made moving object ever, is now sinking on its maiden voyage, full of celebrities. So if you can imagine today, Hollywood people are on board. If you can picture today, you know, I'm kind of dating myself, but you know, Robert De Niro, Joe Pesci, you got all these guys are on this ship. What happened to them? What happened to these movie stars? You know, well, that's what's happening now. You have all these rich people on this ship. Who's gonna be saved here? But Smith, no one bothered to wake up the fifth officer. He was in bed when people were loading in the lifeboats. He heard noise outside his window and saw people with life jackets on, so he came out. What's going on? On the model, you'll see near the end of the ship, the aft end of the ship, it looks like it's a docking bridge, and there's a wheel on it. Quartermaster Thomas Rowe, that was his post of duty. He was standing on that after bridge and saw a lifeboat go by. No one told him they were even loading lifeboats. So there were 3 phones on the Titanic. One naturally was in the bridge, well, of course, one in the crow's nest, but there was one in the forecastle and one on the poop deck where Rowe was stationed. So he picks the phone up and rings the bridge and says, "I just saw a lifeboat go by." "Oh, yeah, we forgot to tell you. Come to the bridge and bring the flares with you." Okay, so he goes up to the bridge with flares. You go, what is going on? So the Titanic hit the iceberg at 11:40. At midnight, Captain Smith walks over to the wireless shack where Phillips and Bryant are, pops his head in and says, "Stand by to send out a distress signal, but don't do it yet. I'll be right back." So Smith disappears for literally about 5 minutes. He comes back, he says, "Start sending the distress signal." So at 12:15, the first distress signal was sent from the Titanic. The initial signal was CQD, CQD, MGY, MGY. MGY were the call letters of the Titanic. Instead of having the Morse code Titanic, all the ships had a 3-letter designation. So CQD, CQD, MGY. They're getting some responses. The Frankfurt, a German ship, was 58 miles away. But the most significant one, as we all know, was the Carpathia, 58 miles away to the southwest. Captain Rostron, Arthur Rostron, was in charge of the Carpathia. Well, Harold Cottam was the wireless operator on the Carpathia. He was the only wireless operator on the ship. He was just on the bridge talking to the deck officers. He went down below, and thank goodness, he turned his set on before turning in. He's literally taking his tie off, and he's hearing the transmission, and he hears CQD, CQD, it's MGY. So he gets on right away. The radio's back. "What is the matter?" Phillips says, "We've struck an iceberg. We're sinking. We need your assistance." He goes, "Should I tell my captain?" He said, "Yes, immediately." So he runs. It's funny because even in the movie, A Night to Remember is a very well done movie, and it sticks very close to the facts. Cottam, or Harold Cottam, the wireless operator, goes up to the bridge and tells the deck officer the Titanic is sinking. They can't believe it. The Titanic? It can't be the Titanic. He goes, "I'm going down to tell the captain." He bursts into the captain's quarters, who's in bed. And the captain was very prim and proper, Arthur Rostron. And he says, "Don't they teach you?" And he cut him off. He said, "I just got a distress signal from the Titanic. She's sinking." He goes, "All right." And he sits up. He goes, "Where is she?" He goes, 58 miles away. He goes, "All right. Are you sure it's the Titanic?" There's always this, "Are you sure it's?" He goes, "Yes, it's the Titanic." "Tell her we're on our way." He runs back, ready as the Titanic, telegraphs. He says, "We're on our way. We can be there in 4 hours." As you know, Thomas Andrews told Captain Smith, "We might have an hour, hour and a half." It would take 2 hours and 20 minutes before the Titanic was on the bottom of the North Atlantic. So Captain Smith realizes 4 hours, but he doesn't want to create panic. He knows that's too late. They can see a light on the horizon. They can see a ship sitting there. And Smith says, "What about that ship over there?" The 4th officer, Boxall, says, "I don't know. They've been saying on the wireless, but she's not responding." He said, "They may not have a 24-hour radio vision." He goes, "Try sending Morse lamp with the Morse," and they tried doing that. They weren't getting anything. But the interesting thing, ladies and gentlemen, about the California, now, like I said, at 12:15, the first distress signal was sent. There were 2 deck officers on the Californian. They saw the Titanic coming up off their starboard side. So they told their captain, Stanley Lord, there's a large passenger ship coming up on the starboard side. Laura says, okay, that would be the Titanic. This is very interesting. So because that would be the Titanic. Try getting in touch with her with Morse lamp. So they did. Well, as the Titanic is coming up at about 11:40, the Titanic, as I told you, did a hard to starboard, full speed astern. So it's making a left. It's swinging its tail this way. All the lights disappear. Now they're looking really almost toward the front of the ship. So they blow, it's a tube. They blow through, it alerts the captain in his room. They listen to it. Very, that was timed. He said, the ship seems to have turned out all its lights. He goes, well, ships do that at night to encourage passengers to go to bed. But it didn't turn out the lights. As you know, it just turned. So the two officers are standing there watching as the night progresses. And they see eventually at 12:45, the first flare is shot up in the air, 12:45. Like fireworks, beautiful mosaic, all the white coming down. And they both remark to each other, why would a ship be firing flares at night? And the other officer says, it's got to be distress. Something can't be right with it. So they blow through the sound tube to the captain. That ship off the starboard side is now firing rockets. Must be company signals of some sort. Try to get in touch with Morse lamp. All they had to do was wake up Cyril Evans, and he would have heard the distress signals loud and clear. They were that close. They didn't do that. So they're sitting there watching these flares, a total of 8 of them being fired. And the officer says the other one, the ship looks a bit queer, as though it's hanging out of the water. And it was. The aft end of the ship is now literally hanging up out of the water. They didn't do anything. They just keep saying it doesn't look right. Why? It's got to be in distress. No one woke up the wireless operator. Just find out what's going on. Keep trying with the Morse lamp. That didn't work, as we know. Well, they're lowering the lifeboats. I'm kind of going through this. I could talk to you for hours about this, but we only have about 3 hours left. And then, but as they're lowering the lifeboats, like I said, the starboard side was Lightoller, the port side was Murdock. Captain Smith seemed to be affected by what was going on in that he wasn't as engaging as he should have been. He never gave the order to start loading the lifeboats. So Lightoller went onto the bridge. He asked Chief Officer Wild, should we start loading the lifeboats? No, we haven't got the order yet from Captain Smith. So he bypasses Wild and goes right up the chain of command to Smith directly, who's standing on the bridge, and he says, shouldn't we start loading the lifeboats? Yes, women and children. So they're doing women and children on a lifeboat that can hold 65 people. It's being lowered away with 12. They're not even filling the lifeboats up because Smith is not telling anybody the ship's going to sink because he doesn't want panic. Some of the officers didn't realize the ship was going to sink. Like Lowe, he wasn't in there when Andrew said the ship was going to sink. 4th officer, anyway, they're lowering away lifeboats a third full. People still feel safer on the deck of the Titanic than getting into a lifeboat out on the open North Atlantic. It's freezing. It's 28-degree water. I'm not getting into that lifeboat. But on the port side, Murdock would load up the lifeboat, and if there were no women and children left, he'd let men get in. All right, everybody, just let's go. We got to get moving here. So it depended on if you were a guy, what side of the ship you stepped out on that night. They began to realize, hey, they're letting guys get in the lifeboats on the port side, the starboard side. The port side, I'm sorry, was Lightoller. So guys started going over there and getting into the boat, or they watched the lifeboats being lowered away and they jump in the water and try to swim over to it if they could survive that water. Because hypothermia, you're thinking 15, 20 minutes in that water, that's it, you're done. So Captain Smith, when they were lowering the lifeboats on the port side, he said, lower it down to the promenade deck, A deck, and then have them go out the windows right there. Well, very interesting fact for you. The Olympic and Titanic were sister ships. The only difference between the Olympic and Titanic, the Olympic, the promenade deck windows were open, always open. The Titanic, they were closed. They were not open. So after he said, we'll just go down, it was actually a passenger, it said, aren't those windows closed though? And Smith's like, oh, yeah, that's right. No, we can't do that. All right. Now, Major Puchin, it's in the movie A Night to Remember, was a yachtsman. And they were lowering a lifeboat. And Quartermaster Robert Hitchens, who was at the helm when the Titanic hit the iceberg, was the seamen in that boat. And he yells up, "Hey, we could use another seaman down here to help out. I'm the only one here." So Puchin steps forward and says, "I'm a yachtsman." And Lightoller says, "Okay." So Smith says, "Well, why don't you go down and go through one of the gangway doors?" And Lightoller says, "If you're seaman enough to jump out onto that rope and lower yourself in the lifeboat, have at it." And he did. He jumped out and lowered himself into the boat and survived as a result. But all the lifeboats are being lowered away. And then what about third class? They're still down in the bowels of the ship and the gates are closed. They're not letting them up. So people are like, "What about us?" They start shaking these gates, and then it's, break the gates down. They get an axe, whatever. So some survivors said they saw hundreds of third-class passengers coming up from the bowels of the ship. There were no lifeboats left at this point. So what are they going to do? So everybody is running toward the stern of the ship. As you know, the ship is sinking down at the bow. So I like to compare it to like an ice cube tray. When you're filling the ice cube tray and the water overflows into the next compartment, and it starts to tip down. That's exactly what the Titanic was like. It was overflowing into the next. Well, and I've been saying this with Mr. Arisman since 1986. The chief banker on the Titanic was Charles Yough. Is anyone familiar with him? Okay. I don't advocate drinking, but this guy did the right thing. Okay. So very early on, he sees what's going on. They're loading lifeboats. So he goes and gets his other assistant bakers, and they get bread, and they're filling up the lifeboats, water. They're doing all this. Well, then he goes downstairs to his cabin, and it's in the movie, Night to Remember. It's so accurate. He gets whiskey, pours himself a glass, and he just starts drinking. And then he goes back up on the boat deck. He helps out where he can, but he's drinking whiskey. And then he goes back down once again. And he sees Dr. O'Loughlin down there too, who's doing the same thing, drinking. And they hear 1,500 people running toward the aft end of the ship above them. So he goes up deck side, and he's feeling pretty good. So he goes to the aft. His story is an amazing survival story. He's actually standing on the outside of the ship as it's going down, holding onto the railing, and he gets to the stern of the ship. And they actually show it in that movie with DiCaprio and Winslet. He's in his white Baker jacket. And when the ship slips beneath the waves, he literally steps into the water. And he said he didn't get his hair wet because he said there was no section. Lifeboats are trying to get away because the ship that big is going to suck everything down with it. Now the ship's split in half. I don't know if that had something to do with it, but he said he didn't get his hair wet. So he's treading water and he's lit up. And he's just looking around, and it's 28-degree water, and it's not affecting him. He was in the water for 2 hours. 2 hours. So we'll fast forward to the inquiry, both in America and England, and they were dumbfounded. They said, "Wait a minute. When did you get into the water?" He said, "Well, at 2:20 when the ship sank." "And you were picked up when?" He said, "Well, the Carpathia arrived at 4 a.m. And you were in the water?" "Yeah." Okay, so he said, I wasn't physically swimming and tiring myself out. I was treading water. And he eventually, when the Titanic was going down, all the lifeboats were launched. They had 4 what are called Engelhart collapsibles. They were flat-bottomed boats that they were going to try to hook up into the davits, but there wasn't enough time left. The ship was going down too quickly at this point. So they floated it off the deck into the water, and it was upside down. Now the second officer, Herbert Lightoller, we'll get back to that baker in a minute. The second officer jumped into the water. He was sucked into a vent and went down a little bit with the ship, but then there must have been an explosion from within the ship that blew him away from the vent and away from the wreck, and he surfaced, and he ended up surviving, but it was an amazing story. He stayed on the ship as long as he possibly could. And his history is interesting. We don't have time tonight, but he'd been involved in other shipwrecks too before the Titanic. But he got to that overturned collapsible and stood on top of it with about 30 other guys. And he kind of commanded, he had a whistle, and he said, when there's a swell, we'll lean one way. And if there's a swell this way, we'll lean this way. and their feet are in water. I mean, it's awash, and they're standing on this boat. Well, the chief baker swims over to that boat, and he's trying to get on, but they won't let him on. So he swims over to the other side. It's one of his assistant bakers that says, "Hey, Charlie, you know, he's trying to pull him up. He goes, "No, I'm all right." He says, "I'm okay right here. I just can't get over it." He's just holding on to this overturned boat full of whiskey. He's all right. So the fifth officer, Harold Lowe, comes over with the two boats, and they put him into a lifeboat. And he ended up getting out of the Carpathia. But he was one of the most popular survivors because they're saying this guy was in the water 28 degrees for 2 hours and lived to tell about it. So my advice was, as Mr. Ayersman and I would always say, if you're on a ship that hits an iceberg and you're in the North Atlantic, I would go grab the nearest bottle of whiskey you can, and just sit down and wait it out. And so the Titanic, I'm jumping around here, but you know, the survivors, of course, Molly Brown gets into the boat with Emma Bucknell. Thomas Hitchens, who was the quartermaster when they hit the iceberg, is in that boat. Well, Molly Brown wants to go back and pick up survivors. And I can hear them all yelling. Hitchens says, "No way, we're not going back. They'll swamp the boat. We are not going back." She said, "You have to go back." He starts saying things to her that you shouldn't say to a lady, but anyway. And then another guy says, "You don't talk to a lady like that." And they go back and forth. Each lifeboat, we don't have time tonight, but each lifeboat really had its own story that you could spend a couple hours talking about. But so Molly Brown was in that boat, and then the Carpathia arrives at 4 a.m. And you know, they see a flare going up to people in the water in the Titanic lifeboats, and they're picked up. The Californian finds out what's going on, and you can imagine what the captain of the Californian was thinking. I mean, that was the Titanic. He even identified it. That would be the Titanic early in the night. So when they get to New York, this was very, very interesting. Ernest Gale was a crew member of the Californian. He was called a donkeyman. I didn't know what a donkeyman was, so I Googled it. Google has everything. Donkeyman, they had what was called donkey engines. So he would tend to the donkey engine in the engine room. Donkeyman, that's what he did. Well, when the Californian got to New York and docked, Captain Lord had a private meeting with his officers before they even got off the ship. And then the ship's log for April 14th, that night, there was no mention of flares or anything. It seemed that page was taken out or wasn't even written down. So he was trying to cover his tracks already. And you know, I know it was in the early 90s, descendants of Captain Lord were still trying to clear his name. And I think the inquiry released something that said, even if he had realized it was the Titanic and steamed to help, they were surrounded by ice, and chances are wouldn't have made it anyway, not in time. But you know, it's frustrating when you read all this stuff, especially the testimony of the officers around California that said something's wrong with that ship, and they didn't do anything. They just sat and watched. So the results of the Titanic, of course, 1,503 were lost, 705 survived. Greatest maritime disaster, and certainly the most infamous when everyone thinks of Titanic. So, of course, after that, there's a 24-hour required radio watch on all ships, and the International Ice Patrol patrols the shipping lanes to make sure there are no icebergs. They've moved the shipping lanes further south, so you can avoid the dangers of the Arctic and what it brings down into the shipping lanes. I'm hoping I covered everything for you. Do you have any questions? Any questions at all? Sir, yes.
Two. Well, you mentioned one of the officers committed suicide.
Yes.
When did he do that?
I'm glad you asked that. So, William Murdock was the first officer. And after the last, well, they had one boat that was left and there was a rush for it. So he fired a weapon. Some survivors say he shot one of the passengers, and then he stepped back and turned the weapon on himself. And Walter Lord had written about that. Now, in A Night to Remember, the first book that came out, which is a phenomenal book on the Titanic, nothing was said about that. I think out of respect for the family members, but there were survivors from different countries who didn't even know each other that said one of the officers turned the weapon on himself. And they said where that happened. And it was the starboard side forward, which is where Murdock was. So that's how they figured it was him.
Did it right on the ship.
Right on the ship, right there on the deck. Yep. Right there.
Okay, one other thing, the Bucknell family. What's the connection to the college?
Okay. See, I immediately called my daughter and said, now I know why you chose Bucknell because of the Titanic. she sort of laughed and said, Dad, this is cool. Anyway. William Bucknell in the late 19th century, it used to be called Lewisburg State University, I think, Lewisburg State University. They were in financial trouble. They needed $50,000 to get out of that financial trouble. Bucknell had a lot of money and he donated $50,000 and hence it became Bucknell University. So yeah, that was it. Yep. Yes, ma'am.
Guggenheim, didn't they go down with the ship?
He did. Yeah, Benjamin Guggenheim. He sure did. Yep.
Why?
Yeah, Astor did, or Madeline Astor lived. Guggenheim went down, but he was with his mistress. His wife was in New York. And yet he had the common courtesy to say, tell my wife that I went down like a gentleman. Yeah, Guggenheim was the one that we dressed in our evening's best and were prepared to get on like gentlemen. He and his butler. Yeah, so yeah, it's Guggenheim. And like I said, the Isidore and Ida Strauss went down together. He was offered a place in a lifeboat, but he was the co-founder of Macy's department store. And he wouldn't leave the ship, and his wife wouldn't leave him. So they both went down together. Yeah, and I'll zip through. I wanted to see, there's some very interesting pictures. I wanted to show you. See the size of the Titanic there. Those are some survivors, folks, right there on the Carpathia. You can see the lifeboats coming up. This is Fifth Officer Harold Lowe, who put the sail up. He was quite the yachtsman. And another interesting thing about the Titanic's officers, they were trained, they had to get certificates. You know, they were at one time apprentices. There was a lot of work they had to do to become officers in the White Star Line, a lot of testing. During their formative years as officers, they were still on sailing ships. So they were exposed to the weather. They're out on the open deck. They can feel the sleet, the rain, the snow, the wind. Now on the Titanic, if you look at the model I built, you're in the wheelhouse, you're really kind of far removed from all those elements that an officer of the sailing days would be accustomed to knowing. So you're removed from that, and the only thing you have are the eyes and ears of those two guys in the lookout in the crow's nest, Lee and Fleet, both of whom survived. Frederick Fleet, who banged the crow's nest bell 3 times and rang the bridge, ended up committing suicide in 1958, which was the year the movie A Night to Remember came out. Now, I don't know that had anything to do with that. His sister, with whom he was living, had passed away, and his brother-in-law was not a big fan of Fred and kicked him out. And he was on hard times, but it's unfortunate what happened to him. The quartermaster was steering the boat, Hitchens, got charged with murder in like the 20s. And ended up doing 4 years in prison. So that's a nice, this picture, ladies and gentlemen, on the left is a picture of the Titanic's, one of Titanic's 29 boilers. That's the first image seen of the Titanic in 1985, when Robert Ballard found the ship, 2.5 miles below the North Atlantic. That's a nice picture of the crow's nest, which you can no longer see because it's kind of disappeared. I think there have been so many expeditions down to the ship, someone's bumped into it. I think it fell into the depths of the ship itself. There's some interesting things. We're almost done with the slides, but I wanted you to see some of these pictures. You can imagine the start Robert Ballard had when they saw that doll's head. They thought it was maybe a real human head at first. But I think there's like 6,000 pounds of pressure per square inch down there. Any body would be pulverized at that depth. So the propeller, you can see on the upper left, some boots on the upper right. There are a lot of shoes and boots that are in the debris field that are lying at such an angle that you can tell someone was in those shoes or boots at one point. The surviving officers, okay, I'm glad we did this. On the left, you have Herbert Pittman standing next to, hey, it works. All right. There's the third officer and the second officer. That's at the inquiry in America, headed by Senator William Alden Smith. They wanted to know what was going on. Britain was wondering, why are the Americans having an inquiry into the wreck of the Titanic? One, it's a British ship. Two, it happened in the middle of the North Atlantic. It's not even their jurisdiction. Why do they want to know? They couldn't have picked a worse person than Senator William Alden Smith, who had zero knowledge of nautical terms, nothing. So when these guys are, of course, now it doesn't work. These guys are, of course, very well adapted to the sea life. I mean, they're professional. So when they're being questioned by a senator who has no idea what he's talking about, they were really contemptuous to Smith. Like one question, Senator Smith asked the fifth officer, Yough, he asked him, what's an iceberg made of? Yeah, Yough said, ice. Okay, so that's the third officer Pittman in later years. And here you've got Pittman, Vauxhall, Lightoller, and Yough. Those are the four surviving officers of the Titanic. That's the inquiry. Bruce Ismay, you remember, I didn't mention it, but you know, he got into a lifeboat. The managing director of the White Star Line stepped into a lifeboat when there were still women and children left on the ship. That's Ismay right there. Yeah, he wanted to get out of Dodge as quickly as possible. And they intercepted a telegraph from Carpathia, Britain. And he signed it, not Ismay, I-S-M-A-Y. He signed it Yamsey, his name backwards, Y-A-M-S-I, saying we are going to try to get back to England as quickly as we can. So the officers and crew members of the Titanic were kind of insulted that they were being questioned by the Americans about the loss of the Titanic. So you have Ismay there. There's Harold Bride, the junior wireless operator. He survived. That's him being brought off the Carpathia. His feet were crushed and frostbitten. So, crew members who survived. This is interesting. There were 4 crew members who were brothers, all 4 of whom lived, the Pascoe brothers. Then there were survivors, crew members who survived signing autographs in Southampton and all that sort of thing. The Californian, very good. This is Captain Stanley Lord. That's the wireless operator, Cyril Evans, who shut his apparatus off at 11 p.m. after the wireless operator of the Titanic told him to shut up and stay out. So these were the officers who were on the deck when the Titanic was sinking and saw all that flares. And the captain of the Carpathia was heralded as a hero. He went right to work. As soon as he got the distress signal, he summoned his officers to the deck of the bridge. He got blankets. He had the cooks go into the kitchen, start making hot soup, coffee, tea. I want blankets, gangways. I want passengers move other parts of the ship so we can open up rooms. There were passengers on the Carpathia that thought something was wrong with the Carpathia. So they were asking deckhands, what's going on? The Titanic is sinking. They didn't believe that. The Titanic can't be sinking. Something's got to be wrong with our ship. But Rostron, you see, that's a medal, got an award from the unsinkable Molly Brown. But he would become the commander of the Mauritania in a few years later. His actions saved 703 survivors. He did everything, and he was going full speed ahead, dodging icebergs and everything to get to the Titanic as quickly as he possibly could. And he got the Congressional Medal of Honor from the United States for his actions. Now, it's not the same Medal of Honor that military received. A little bit different, but they still call it a Congressional Medal of Honor for what he did. But he went right to work. I mean, very impressive individual. So, Titanic in the movies. So I told you about the movie A Night to Remember. It's a phenomenal movie. That's the director of the movie, William McQuitty. As a young boy, he was there when the Titanic was launched in 1912. He watched, and this is Third Officer Pittman and Fourth Officer Joe Boxhall, who were on set as advisors. Lawrence Beasley, a survivor, was also on. Now, this is the actor who played Captain Smith. That's Captain Smith's daughter, the wife, who was there on the set. And she told that actor, "You look exactly like my dad. You really do look like." Okay, we're almost. This I took when I was in Washington, D.C. That's the Titanic Memorial. What does that remind you of, ladies and gentlemen? Was it? Kate Winslet, of course. And I wish we could go back to A Night to Remember, not that movie. Her spinning off the back. But my kids got tired of going around with me to see all the Titanic memorials. Could we go see another memorial, Dad? Gee whiz. So actually, my daughters Molly and Aaron are on the bottom of this. Just they were cut out. I tried to get it fitted in, but that is exactly why James Cameron had Kate Winslet do that, because of the memorial in Washington, D.C. Okay. The other memorial, Archibald, President Taft's military, Archibald Buck, went down with the Titanic. So when I was at the White House for 10 years, park on the South Ellipse, there's a memorial right there. It's not exposed to the public, to President Taft's military aid. In fact, Your Honor, I think when we went to the White House, we parked pretty close to that memorial, lost in the Titanic. I took a picture, I would have it somewhere, but maybe we'll do another presentation next year. I'll get lost in it. I'll show you that too. Anyway, that's there. And then that's yours truly in Belfast at the Titanic Memorial. Notice I'm by myself. There's Pat. So I board them all in that C5 for 6 hours way home. But there's the memorial there. But that, ladies and gentlemen, is it. I sure hope you learned something new tonight. I know it's been 110 years. You think you've heard everything you can hear. Yes, ma'am.
What do you think? So the guy had drunk whiskey and actually survived for 2 hours in the water. How do you think he actually survived?
I think it was that alcohol in his system somehow conditioned him to withstand the very cold water.
I do these things at night. And I was either the whiskey just made his brain just go crazy.
I'm sure it did.
Or the whiskey just walked out the hydrant.
Yes. Good, young lady. Are there any other questions about the Titanic? Yes, sir. Yeah.
Bruce's name later down the years get prosecuted. I read it in a book my Uncle Terry got me a while ago for Christmas. What are your thoughts on how long he got prosecuted for?
Now, he was held as like the scapegoat in England. He ended up leaving the White Star Line and buying a place in Scotland, like a farm in Scotland, and kind of lived as a recluse and was removed. I don't know that he was prosecuted. I know he was blackballed. No one wanted anything to do with him. Now, Alexander Carlisle worked for Harland and Wolff, and he was in charge of safety for the ships. Okay. He initially called for 60 lifeboats for the Titanic, 60. And he said, we need 60 lifeboats for a ship this size. White Star Line said, we don't want that many lifeboats because it takes up too much deck space. We want the passengers to be able to sit and enjoy the open air. So he kept fighting and fighting for 60 lifeboats. Then he went down to 40. Then he ended up ultimately with 20. On the day of the Titanic Memorial service at St. Paul's in London, it was April 18th, I believe. He actually passed out. He was so overcome with grief, he passed out during the memorial service, and they had to carry him out of there, out to his carriage. So he ended up leaving White Star Line. Yes, sir, go ahead.
And there was another statement as well that people on the internet had put out about the Titanic. There was a fire in the bottom parts of the Titanic, which actually weakened the plates and the rivets on the exact side of the starboard side of the Titanic.
Excellent point. Yeah, there was a coal fire which had weakened that area of the Titanic. That's right.
Some say it was actually meant, they actually meant to wreck the Titanic. So that's just like hit on that specific side. There's theories out there about it, but just so it's not on it.
What?
Fire on the exact side.
Yeah, that's true. There was a coal fire, and it made me think of British sailors who survived blamed any cowardly acts by crew members on either the French or the Italian. They really did. They said, well, actually the French, they had a cafe on the Titanic that was actually staffed by French workers. And they called it the Cafe Parisien. I'm pronouncing that right. I think only one of them survived. The British were very anti-French. In fact, I have a buddy that I worked with when I was in the Secret Service. He's still that way with the French. He can't stand the French. Anyway, I don't know what it is, but the French were blamed for any cowardly acts, and so were the Italians. And even during the inquiry, well, that must have been an Italian crew member. Like, gee whiz, they don't hide anything. So, yes, ma'am.
Did they actually have the band playing during the singing?
They did. That's a great question. And Mr. Ayersman and I would always talk about that. The band, Wallace Hartley, came out on deck and said, well, we're going to play some music to calm the nerves, just as when you're eating dinner. It's a very relaxing atmosphere. So I have 3 Titanic music CDs back there. That friend of mine who hates the French from England, when he and his wife came over, we toured the Titanic exhibit in Baltimore. So it was neat having people from England going through that. He bought me the 1 CD. But anyway, Wallace Hartley and the band members played literally until they could stand no more. And the deck was too steep for them to stand. The last person, Harold Bride, who was the junior wireless operator, came out of the wireless room and saw that Engelhart collapsible that they were trying to put in the davit, and it just ended up being thrown over the side of the ship. And Lightoller was standing on top of it. Well, Bride went over there. He said the last song he heard the band playing was Autumn. But there's other passengers, there are other survivors who said the last song they remember hearing was Nearer My God to Thee. Okay, and then years later, this was a very interesting story. There was a female passenger who naturally survived, was in a church service. This is like 25 years later. And they played Nearer My God to Thee, and she started crying and had to get up and leave the service because it took her right back to April 15th, 1912. She had to go. So music has that quality, doesn't it? No matter what you're doing, you'll hear a song and it'll take you back to a time in your life. Good or bad, that's right. So, but the band was heralded as heroes. Wallace Hartley's body was recovered. He had strapped to his chest that violin I told you in its case that's now in Pigeon Forge, Tennessee, in the museum on display. So I watched History's Mysteries or something a few months ago, and they were talking about that violin. And it was handed from one family member to another. You know, what do we do with this violin? No, I don't want it. You know, but it had the inscription from his wife to Wallace.
I know, I saw it.
You saw that, right? Yeah. Yeah, so.
It was right after they got it too.
Yeah, so.
It was cool, but it was
very eerie. So they find his body floating in the North Atlantic and with the violin. So they sent the violin back to the family. So when they brought his body back to his hometown, there were 40,000 people that lined the streets to pay him homage.
Actually, his fiance had it until she died, they said.
Okay.
Before they like passed it on and stuff,
Right.
and then it was over.
Very good. Yep. But yeah, so all those people turned out for any other questions? Yes.
Wasn't their big sister was the Olympic and the Titanic?
Yes. I'm glad you said that. So the Titanic was the middle child because the Olympic was the older one, right? So the Titanic and then the Britannic. But do you know what the original name was of the Britannic? Gigantic. And you know why they changed it? Because they were warned, do not name that ship the Titanic, because the Titans took on Zeus in Greek mythology, and guess who won that battle? Zeus. So they said Titanic was not a good name. So White Star Line officials said, you know what, we might want to think that gigantic namesake. They named it Britannic. which sank anyway in World War I when it hit a mine. It was a hospital troop ship. There was actually a crew member on the Titanic, was also a crew member on the Titanic, survived both sinking. I wouldn't get on the ship she was on. And any other questions about the Titanic? Or any crew members? Thank you very much. And I'm laying the keel tomorrow for the Lusitania model with the same scale as that one. And we're going to do the Lusitania next summer of 2023. And then I'll be talking about the last hanging in Waynesburg on June 6th of this year.
In fact,
Yes, sir.
I have a comment. As a teacher, I was very fortunate to have Pat in my class. And I think you can all see why I kept having him come back year after year after year. I salute you.
Thank you. Oh, my parents, mom and dad, they made the trip. Yep. Thank you, everybody.